When a barefoot child was found alone on a deserted highway in the dead of night, the first words out of his mouth froze an entire police department in their tracks. What seemed at first like a simple rescue soon unveiled a sinister truth, one that threatened innocent lives and revealed a dark network hiding in plain sight. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you believe in the relentless pursuit of justice, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories that champion truth. Officer Melissa Hart adjusted her uniform cap as she guided her police cruiser along a lonely stretch of State Route 19 in rural Oregon, well past midnight. It was near the end of another routine shift, and she felt that familiar tug of fatigue behind her eyes. The winter air was unforgiving, and gusts of wind battered the tall evergreens that lined the road. She was considering heading back to the station when she spotted a small silhouette trudging along the side of the highway, illuminated briefly by the headlights. A trickle of alarm threaded through her as she hit the brakes. She eased the cruiser to a stop and switched on her light bar, the alternating blue and red beams piercing the dark. Her heart pounded. It was not unusual to spot a stranded motorist or a lost hitchhiker, but the figure was too small to be an adult. She exited her vehicle, radio at her hip, and called out, "You okay there?" The only response was the hiss of wind across asphalt. Drawing closer, she realized it was a boy, maybe 10 years old, barefoot, shivering in the sub-freezing temperature, and clothed only in thin pajama bottoms and a rumpled t-shirt. His hair clung to his forehead, damp from either sweat or tears. She couldn't see his expression clearly in the gloom. "Hey, buddy," Melissa said softly, crouching to meet him at eye level. "I'm Officer Hart. Are you hurt?" The boy didn't answer at first. His lips trembled, eyes unfocused, as though he were trapped in some half-conscious state. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He jerked, startled, but didn't pull away. Then his voice emerged, raw and hollow. "They're still in the van." Those 4 words sent a chill skittering up Melissa's spine. "Who's in the van?" she asked, urgency creeping into her tone. He swallowed hard, as if trying to dredge up the courage to speak. "My brother, my sister. We were asleep. The van is turned over." Melissa suppressed a jolt of panic. "Do you know where it is?" The boy nodded haltingly. "Somewhere near the river. We went off the road. Think. The lights," he shivered violently. Without wasting another second, she radioed for backup and wrapped her jacket around the child's shoulders. He was so cold she feared he'd slip into hypothermia if he stayed out there any longer. "What's your name?" she asked, guiding him toward the police cruiser's open door, where the heater blasted a welcome stream of warm air. He replied, sinking into the passenger seat, eyes distant. "I'm Eli." "All right, hang tight," Melissa said. The immediate priority was to find that van. She drove slowly as Eli pointed out landmarks. He recalled a certain turnoff, a dimly lit exit, and a crooked sign for a campsite. It took 20 painstaking minutes, combing side roads near the river's bend, but at last they spotted fresh tire tracks in the mud, trailing dangerously off the edge of a steep embankment. Faint starlight glistened on water below. Melissa pulled over, shone her high beams down the slope, and her stomach twisted when she made out the faint shape of a van's rear bumper protruding from the water. She spoke calmly but firmly over her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hart. I've located a submerged vehicle near the old river bend off County Road 6. Requesting immediate EMS and rescue." A second patrol car arrived moments later, followed by an ambulance. The paramedics hustled to the water's edge, flashlights darting across the partially submerged van. The front end looked crumpled against rocks on the riverbank, while the rear half jutted at a precarious angle from the shallows. There was no sign of an adult driver. When one of the paramedics waded into the frigid water and peered through the back window, his urgent voice rang out. "I've got a pulse on a little girl, unconscious, but alive." With careful maneuvering, they extracted a 6-year-old child strapped into a seat. Her face was ghostly pale, hair tangled over her cheeks. She was breathing, but so shallowly that Melissa worried she might slip away at any moment. A second rescue worker discovered a boy of around 4 years old slumped under a soaked blanket in the back seat, barely responsive. The paramedics hoisted both children out, rushing them to waiting ambulances. The reek of damp earth and gas fumes filled the air as water sluiced from the van's open doors. Melissa stood by, heart lodged in her throat, while the paramedics fought to stabilize the two younger kids. She caught glimpses of pale arms and motionless torsos under layers of medical blankets. In the swirl of red and blue emergency lights, the scene felt surreal, as though nightmares had bled into reality. Eli, still barefoot and trembling, stood a short distance away, a paramedic's jacket draped around him. She joined him, gently placed a hand on his shoulder again. "They found them," she said softly. "Your brother and sister are going to the hospital right now." He stared up at her, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." In that quiet moment, Melissa promised herself she would do everything in her power to keep those 3 children safe. She had no idea how deep this promise would take her into a realm of corruption and heartbreak far beyond a simple car accident, but she felt in her bones that something was terribly wrong. The next day, sunlight illuminated the aftermath of the crash site. Tow trucks hauled the ruined van from the water, and forensic investigators combed it for clues. It didn't take them long to notice suspicious details. The driver's seatbelt was unbuckled, but no driver was found at or near the scene. Blood spatters on the steering wheel suggested an injury, yet there was no sign of the injured party. Melissa spent the early morning at Stillwater Bend Community Hospital, a modest facility serving the region. She needed to check on Eli and the other children who had been admitted overnight. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed, and the smell of antiseptic tugged at her memory. She had been here many times, responding to accidents or visiting injured colleagues. She found Eli sitting upright on a small cot in the pediatric ward. He looked exhausted, cradling a styrofoam cup of orange juice. His bare feet were tucked under a thin blanket the nurses had given him. When Melissa approached, he tried to straighten his posture, as though bracing himself for bad news. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, pulling up a stool beside him. He shrugged. "My toes are still numb, but better, I guess." She handed him a set of folded clothes another officer had picked up from a local donation drive. "It's not much," she said, "but it should keep you warm." His mouth moved in a silent expression of thanks. She noticed the faint bruising on his wrists and arms. Old bruises, not from the crash. Her eyes flickered with concern, but she bit her tongue. She didn't want to push him too hard yet. "Your brother and sister, they're stable," she told him. "Doctors say they'll be here a while to recover. They're still monitoring them, though your sister hasn't woken up yet." He exhaled in relief. Then he looked at the floor, hesitant. "I thought they died," he said, tears threatening to spill. "When the water came in, I tried to help them, but I couldn't breathe." Melissa's heart ached at the raw fear in his voice. "You did what you could," she reassured him. "You got out and you got help. That made all the difference." A nurse approached, adjusting the bandage on Eli's scraped knee. She gave Melissa a meaningful glance that said, "He's been through a lot." Once she stepped away, Melissa continued gently. "Do you remember anything about the man driving the van?" Eli swallowed hard, nodding. "He said we were going to a new family. He said we had to be quiet and sleep in the back seat." Melissa felt a tingle of unease at the phrase new family. "Did he give you a name? Maybe mention the place?" "No. He got mad when I asked questions," Eli whispered, his voice tight with fear. "He said to just do what I was told." Before Melissa could ask more, a doctor peeked in. A tall, middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, Dr. Nishida introduced herself. She pulled the curtain around the cot for privacy. "Officer Hart, the younger children have no major external injuries, but we'll need to keep them for a while. They're showing signs of sedation," she said, frowning. "We're waiting on toxicology reports. As for this one," she gave Eli a gentle pat on the shoulder, "he's malnourished and extremely underweight for his age. He also has older bruises and contusions, possibly from physical abuse." Melissa's jaw clenched. She wasn't entirely surprised. Something about the entire scenario stank of neglect or something darker. The driver's absence, the suspicious nature of the children's injuries. She needed to find out what was going on. Later that afternoon, she returned to the station, where her colleague, Officer Brent Donovan, leaned against a desk. He greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "Heard you had quite a morning," he said. "They towed that van in for forensics. This is weirder than we thought." Melissa set her keys down, crossing her arms. "How so?" Donovan pulled up the vehicle registration on his computer. "Van's registered to a guy named Greg Tarlow. Lives in Eugene. He reported it stolen a week ago." "That might explain the missing driver," Melissa mused. "But does Tarlow have any link to these kids?" Donovan clicked through the data. Nothing stands out. Tarlow is a middle-aged office manager with a clean record. But get this, when we searched the glove box, we found a bunch of documents. Foster care forms with different kids' names, some blank medical forms, and a burner phone. Looks real suspicious. A weight settled in Melissa's gut. She thought of Eli's words, new family, a stolen van, foster care documents for children who might not all be related. The puzzle pieces suggested something far more sinister than a simple crash. She pulled out her chair, scanned the notes. "Any leads from the burner phone?" Donovan shook his head. "Not yet. We're waiting on phone records, but I bet the driver tossed it or wiped it. We'll see what the tech guys can recover." Melissa rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. "I have a bad feeling about this. The hospital says the kids show signs of sedation. This wasn't some harmless road trip." He nodded, lips pressing into a grim line. "What do you need?" "Honestly, more manpower," she said, scanning the cramped station. With just a handful of officers, Stillwater Bend's department was not equipped for a complex child-related investigation that might extend across counties or even states. "We should probably talk to county detectives, maybe state authorities. This could be big." Within hours, the station reached out to a specialized unit that handled crimes against children. Detectives from the state capital promised to send help. In the meantime, Melissa found herself restless, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle. She visited the hospital daily, checking on the children's condition. The littlest boy regained consciousness sporadically, crying and disoriented, while the 6-year-old girl was on the cusp of waking but still heavily medicated. Each time, seeing them so vulnerable stoked a protective anger in Melissa's chest. On the third day, a detective from the state's Child Exploitation Task Force arrived. Jenna Alvarez, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm demeanor that belied her fierce reputation for cracking cases. She wore a simple gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. From the moment she introduced herself with a firm handshake, Melissa sensed an ally who shared her urgency. They set up in a quiet corner of the station and reviewed the evidence: stolen van, mismatched foster care documents, blank medical intake forms, the half-broken phone. Jenna scribbled notes, lips pursed. "I've handled trafficking cases before," she said. "This is exactly how they transport kids under the radar, falsifying foster care transfers, forging signatures, then shipping the children off as if they were being moved to a new foster home. Too often, no one double-checks." Melissa's stomach churned. "So you're saying these kids might have been trafficked?" Jenna nodded solemnly. "It happens more than we'd like to believe. A driver with a forged ID picks them up, claiming to be from a child placement agency. The real fosters or orphanages either can't keep track or assume it's legit. Then the kids vanish, with official records stating they've been reunified or placed in a new family out of state." "It's horrifying," Melissa said, pressing a hand to her mouth. She remembered the terror in Eli's eyes, how he believed no one would come for them. "Let's see if we can link this to any known criminal networks," Jenna continued, flipping through her files. "We've had a string of disappearances in the region, foster kids unaccounted for, all marked as placed in new homes." Melissa bit her lip. "What's next?" "First, let's talk to Tarlow, the van's owner, to see if he's really a victim or an accomplice." They made the 2-hour drive to Eugene. Tarlow answered the door of a modest ranch-style home, looking equal parts wary and confused when 2 officers showed up. He was a slight man in his early 40s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a sweater vest that gave him a mild appearance. Melissa introduced them and explained the situation. "We recovered your van. It was involved in an accident. 3 children were inside, and the driver fled the scene. Tarlow's eyebrows shot up. Children? My van? But it was stolen a week ago. I filed a police report. We have that report, Jenna interjected. Where were you when it was stolen? He paused, adjusting his glasses. I was at home sleeping. My neighbor noticed the broken window the next morning and told me the van was gone. Though he seemed truthful, they asked more questions, ensuring he had no ties to the children or the suspicious documents. Tarlow insisted he'd never heard of them. He appeared genuinely upset at the notion that his van had been used for something so dark. When they left, Jenna shrugged. He seems clueless. We'll keep him on the list just in case, but I suspect the thieves targeted his van at random. Or specifically, Melissa mused, because a random stolen vehicle is harder to trace. They returned to the station, exhausted. But the case pressed on. The next day, a partial break came from the half-repaired burner phone. Tech specialists managed to extract a few text messages referencing delivery times, safe houses, and cryptic addresses. One thread mentioned a date, 2 days after the crash. The text read, "Need new transport. Last route compromised. Possibly meeting at warehouse? We'll confirm." Jenna and Melissa exchanged a glance. "They're still moving kids," Jenna said, her voice taut. "We have to act fast." They scoured the addresses from the phone's data, discovering multiple leads, most dead ends, parking lots, vacant buildings, even a field. But one stood out, a small warehouse about 90 miles away, near the city of Dunfield. It seemed to have a connection to a suspicious individual who'd been spotted using forged IDs in convenience stores and gas stations. Melissa's pulse quickened. If they plan to move kids again, they might be doing it soon. Jenna called in reinforcements, coordinating with Dunfield's local police. They arranged an overnight stakeout. In unmarked vehicles, the team took positions around the warehouse perimeter. The area was a bleak industrial park, a patchwork of empty lots, loading docks, and chain-link fences. Lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. Melissa huddled in her car, periodically sipping coffee that had long gone lukewarm. Through binoculars, she watched for any sign of movement. Hours ticked by. Midnight came and went. A few trucks rumbled past on the main road, but none stopped at the warehouse. Just when her eyelids began to droop, headlights slashed through the darkness. A cargo van approached the warehouse gate. Its license plates were smeared with mud, as though deliberately obscured. 2 figures stepped out, scanning the area nervously. Jenna's voice crackled over the radio. "I count 2 men. Possibly armed. Keep your distance." Melissa's heart thumped. She watched the men unlock the warehouse door and back the cargo van up to a loading bay. One of them motioned as though directing an unseen occupant inside. After a tense moment, they yanked open the cargo van's sliding door. In the dim light, Melissa caught sight of a small shape. A child? It was too dark to be sure. She and Jenna exchanged a glance from their vantage points, even though they were in separate cars. This was probable cause. They had a strong reason to believe children were being trafficked. The plan was to maintain visual confirmation that a child was indeed present before making their move, to ensure a solid case. But as the child, clearly a child, struggling in the man's grip, was pulled into the warehouse, something inside Melissa snapped. "We can't let them vanish," she thought. She keyed her mic, voice trembling with urgency. "They're bringing a kid inside. We have to move." "Agreed," Jenna said grimly. "All units, go." The unmarked vehicles roared to life, headlights flaring. Officers in tactical gear bolted from their hiding spots, guns drawn. The men at the warehouse reacted in alarm, cursing as they tried to shut the bay door. One fired a weapon, the muzzle flashed bright against the gloom. Police shouted warnings. Melissa ducked behind the open door of her vehicle, adrenaline pumping. She watched as an officer kicked the warehouse door open, and the rest surged inside. Gunshots rang out, a brief exchange, then a tense silence. She ran forward, heart pounding, fumbling with her flashlight. Inside, the warehouse smelled of dust and stale air. Pallets of boxes were stacked high, forming canyons of cramped pathways. The chaotic glow of flashlights revealed a shocking scene. At the back, near a makeshift office, were 6 cots lined against the wall, child-sized, each with rumpled blankets. There were no kids lying in them now, but it was enough to confirm their suspicions. Nearby, a desk bristled with forged documents, passports, medical forms, and a stack of ID photos featuring children of various ages. Among them, horrifyingly, was a photo of Eli, wide-eyed as though he'd been caught off guard. The men had been subdued by the police, pinned to the concrete floor, cursing and spitting. The child they'd been transporting, a boy around 8, cowered behind a stack of crates. Melissa carefully approached him, her voice soft. "It's okay," she said. "We won't hurt you." He stared with panic-stricken eyes, shivering despite the stale warmth of the warehouse. Eventually, a paramedic coaxed him out, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. He was whisked away, safe for the moment. Evidence teams descended on the warehouse. They found boxes of forged foster papers, medical records, birth certificates, tools to shuffle children from one place to another under false pretenses. The men in custody refused to answer questions, snarling defiance. One spat at a detective, prompting an officer to tighten his cuffs. Jenna and Melissa exchanged grim looks. They knew this warehouse was only one node in a bigger network. In the early hours of the morning, the team regrouped at the station. The rescued boy was taken to a local hospital for evaluation. The suspects were identified as low-level couriers with ties to an interstate ring that specialized in child trafficking. But neither was the man who had driven the stolen van in Stillwater Bend. Melissa sank into a chair in the conference room, exhaustion heavy in her bones. Jenna paced, hands on her hips. "We'll interrogate them," she muttered. "One of them might crack." "Let's hope," Melissa said, rubbing her temples. "We can't let them slip away again. This entire ring needs to be dismantled." Days turned into a blur of paperwork, court orders, and forensic analysis. The men eventually lawyered up, refusing to talk. But from phone records and partial confessions gleaned from other leads, a clearer picture emerged. These criminals were part of a multi-state operation, forging documents for children who were never meant to reach legitimate foster families. They were sold, traded, or worse. The children were often drugged or threatened, ensuring minimal resistance. Eli and his siblings were only a few of the ring's victims. That knowledge weighed heavily on Melissa's mind. She visited them frequently at the hospital. The 4-year-old boy, now conscious, still whimpered at any sudden movement. The 6-year-old girl, her name was Kaylee, according to Eli, finally opened her eyes, but she was terrified, withdrawn, clinging to a teddy bear a nurse had given her. One afternoon, as Melissa prepared to leave the hospital, a petite nurse caught her in the hallway. "Officer," she said quietly, "Eli has been drawing pictures. He wants to show you something." Melissa followed her back to the pediatric ward. Eli sat at a small table, crayons scattered around him. He hesitated, then held up a sheet of paper depicting a stick-figure policeman with a star-like badge. Another figure, also a stick-figure child, stood beside the policeman. "Is that me?" she asked gently. He nodded, eyes flicking away shyly. "You came back," he said. His voice wavered. "Nobody ever comes back for us." His words struck her like a physical blow. She crouched, resting a hand on his back. "I'm not leaving you alone in this," she promised. That night, she lay awake in bed, the hush of her small rental house broken only by the hum of the heater. She thought of the children in that hospital, how they had nowhere to go, no relatives stepping forward. How many times had they been moved from one place to another, trusting that eventually they'd find a real home? But it never came. She recalled the nerve-wracking sting operation at the warehouse, the sight of those cots, the innocent faces in the ID photos. She clenched her fists. "I can't let them slip through the cracks again." The next morning at the station, Jenna told her they'd finally found a lead on the driver who abandoned the van. Surveillance footage from a gas station an hour from Stillwater Bend showed a tall man in a baseball cap refueling a silver van just days before the crash, paying in cash. The store clerk remembered him specifically because he had snapped at a child who tried to climb out of the van. "Matches Eli's story," Jenna said, tapping the photo. "We ran it through facial recognition, came up with a partial match for a guy named Kevin Rourke. He's used multiple aliases in prior child trafficking investigations. He's dangerous, never stays in one place for long. Melissa gazed at the grainy still image, anger simmering. And he's still out there. Yeah. But we'll find him, Jenna assured her. In the meantime, we can't ignore that we've got more kids to rescue. Our best bet is to keep working up the chain, see who's running the show. Their investigation kicked into high gear. They discovered a pattern of missing foster children across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, many of whom were listed as reunited or placed under suspicious circumstances. Authorities in each state had their own overburdened systems, and the criminals exploited that chaos with forged records. Melissa spent hours on phone calls, coordinating with child services, verifying which placements were legitimate. Over and over, she encountered incomplete files, contradictory signatures, or children who simply vanished from the system's radar. Each time, her resolve hardened. Meanwhile, the children's healing was slow. Kaylee finally spoke more than a few syllables, recounting in halting detail how the driver had forced them to remain silent during the trip. The 4-year-old who answered to Tony had night terrors, waking up screaming about water and cold darkness. And Eli hovered near them, protective like a little guardian, but so weighted by guilt. He blamed himself for not preventing the crash, for not rescuing them sooner. One evening, Melissa found Eli slumped in a hospital hallway, tears tracking down his cheeks. He looked up as she approached. "Everyone keeps asking me the same questions," he said. "It's scary. I don't know all the answers." Melissa sighed, crouching down to his eye level. "They're just trying to help," she whispered. "But I understand how stressful that must be." He wiped his nose on his sleeve. "My brother and sister, are we gonna stay together?" She paused, unsure how to answer. The foster system, especially in cross-state complications, often separated siblings, no matter how well-intentioned the bureaucracy was. The thought made her stomach twist. "I'm going to do everything I can," she promised. She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not giving up on you three." Soon enough, the press caught wind of a potential child trafficking ring operating in the region, stirring outrage from local communities. Journalists swarmed the police station, hungry for details. The sudden attention worried some officers, who feared it might drive the criminals deeper underground. But public awareness also brought tips from concerned citizens. Some recognized suspicious individuals, others reported abandoned buildings where they'd seen children. Most tips were duds, but a handful offered new leads. One lead pointed them to a nondescript warehouse in yet another county, but it was already cleaned out by the time they arrived. Only dusty floors and a pungent odor of rotting food remained. Another lead took them to an isolated farmhouse that had once functioned as an illegal daycare, but it too was empty. The criminals were always one step ahead, a wraith-like presence that vanished the moment the authorities got too close. In the midst of these tense weeks, Melissa's personal life fell by the wayside. She barely had time to call her parents or see friends. Her mind churned with images of frightened children, each day revealing more evidence of an organized pipeline that abducted or misled foster kids. She felt a gnawing sense of responsibility to do more. One day, when she was particularly frustrated, Jenna took her aside. "I know it feels like we're chasing ghosts, but we are making a difference," she said. "We saved those kids in the warehouse. We're forcing these criminals to move, leaving breadcrumbs behind. We'll find them." Melissa nodded, appreciating the support. "Yeah. I just hate the idea of even one more child being taken." She thought again of Eli's words, "No one ever comes back for us." Eventually, a bigger break arrived. One of the suspects from the Dunfield warehouse, facing hefty charges, decided to talk in exchange for a reduced sentence. He revealed that the ring was orchestrated by a small group of masterminds who specialized in forging official documents. Their operations spread across 4 or 5 states, maybe more. Children were trafficked for various illegal purposes. The suspect didn't know the entire hierarchy, but he provided a crucial name, Rowan. He called him the ring's top man in the Pacific Northwest. Rowan was rumored to be extremely careful, rarely showing himself in public, orchestrating everything from behind shell companies. The suspect also mentioned a rumored final destination for the children, a wealthy buyer or buyers who provided large sums of cash. The details were hazy, but it confirmed what the team already feared. These kids were effectively sold. Jenna and Melissa took this information to the regional FBI field office. With cross-state lines involved, the FBI had jurisdiction and resources to coordinate a multi-agency crackdown. Soon, a small task force formed, merging local police, state detectives, and federal agents. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Wires were set up, informants placed under protective watch, and law enforcement scoured the region for signs of Rowan's presence. Meanwhile, Melissa juggled her day-to-day duties in Stillwater Bend, checking in on Eli and his siblings whenever she could. Kaylee had begun to speak in short sentences. Tony was slowly trusting nurses enough to let them examine him without screaming. Eli hovered between hope and despair, clinging to the fragments of normalcy the hospital offered. Then, a single text from an informant changed everything. Rowan meeting high-level contact next week, location TBA. The task force braced for a possible sting, anticipating that Rowan might show himself in order to finalize a new batch of child transfers. Days before the rumored meeting, the hospital decided the younger children were stable enough for a temporary foster arrangement. But local foster homes were full or ill-equipped to handle traumatized kids with no immediate family or official records. The thought of them being shipped off to a different county, potentially separating them, weighed heavily on Melissa. She spent sleepless nights thinking about it. One afternoon, as she walked through the hospital's pediatric ward, she overheard a social worker explaining to a nurse that the siblings would likely be split up, placed wherever there was an available bed. Eli stood nearby, face pale. Without hesitation, Melissa stepped forward. She found herself saying, "What if I took them in, at least for now?" The social worker blinked in surprise. "You, Officer Hart?" "Yes," she said firmly, though her heart pounded. She had never considered fostering before, let alone 3 children, but the thought of them being separated spurred her into action. "I'll do whatever paperwork is necessary. I can't stand by while they're torn apart." The social worker studied her with concern. "Are you certain? This is a big responsibility, especially given their trauma. And you're already busy." "I understand," Melissa interrupted gently. "But I want to try. They trust me." Later that day, she told Eli the news. His expression was a mixture of hope and trepidation. "You mean we'd stay with you?" "Just until a permanent solution is found," she said, trying to temper his expectations. "But yes, you'd all stay together at my house. That is, if you want to." He nodded vigorously, tears in his eyes. "Please. I promise we'll be good." The next week was a blur of paperwork, home visits by child services, and frantic errands to prepare her modest one-bedroom place for 3 kids. She borrowed an air mattress from a colleague, scoured local secondhand shops for children's blankets and clothes, and rearranged her living room to accommodate a small play area. It was far from perfect, but the social worker reluctantly approved it as a temporary solution, given the circumstances. The day Kaylee and Tony were discharged, Melissa felt a flutter in her stomach. She drove them to her home, Eli in the back seat with his brother and sister. Kaylee stared out the window, hugging a teddy bear. Tony dozed off, still somewhat groggy from his earlier medications. Eli kept his gaze on the passing scenery. When they arrived, she ushered them inside. "Welcome to my place," she said with a forced brightness, painfully aware of the cramped living area. The kids looked around timidly. She had prepared a small bedroom for Kaylee and Tony, with a single bed they'd have to share for now, and she set up a cot for Eli in the corner. She'd sleep on the couch, she decided, at least for a while. Over dinner, simple spaghetti with sauce from a jar, the children remained mostly silent. Tony pushed noodles around with his fork, Kaylee methodically chewed without expression, and Eli eyed the plate like it might disappear at any second. Melissa tried to lighten the mood by talking about the old orchard near the house, how the apples were amazing in autumn. But the children seemed too wary to fully engage. After dinner, she showed them the small yard where a scraggly willow tree stood, bending in the evening breeze. Kaylee reached out and touched one of the leaves, as if testing whether the world was real. Tony clung to her side, eyes darting anxiously. Eventually, they all settled down for the night. Melissa lay on the couch, listening to the muffled sounds of rustling blankets, wondering if she'd done the right thing. She felt overwhelmed. But she also felt a fierce determination not to fail these kids. The next morning, real life intruded. The task force had new intel on Rowan's rumored meeting. Melissa was called in for briefing, leaving the children in the temporary care of a kind neighbor she trusted. It pained her to leave them so soon, but she had to see this through. She needed to help end the nightmare for so many other children. In a dingy conference room at the regional FBI office, agents pinned up maps and phone logs. A small group of men tied to Rowan had booked a private space at a remote lodge in the mountains. The location was known for corporate retreats, far from prying eyes. The date matched the text from the informant. This was their chance. A plan took shape. Agents would pose as staff or guests at the lodge, hoping to confirm Rowan's presence. Others would discreetly surround the area. If Rowan indeed arrived for a final transaction or meeting, they'd have him cornered. But everyone was on edge. Rowan had slipped away before, and he employed bodyguards and layers of obfuscation. A single misstep might let him vanish again, or endanger any children who might be with him. Melissa wasn't sure if she'd be allowed to join the operation. She was still a local officer, less experienced in federal stings. But she'd been instrumental in the case, and Jenna vouched for her. Ultimately, they permitted her to be on standby with the perimeter team, though she wouldn't be front and center. She spent the following week juggling the new foster arrangement and the operations preparations. At home, Kaylee withdrew into herself, occasionally humming tunelessly. Tony followed Eli everywhere, clutching Eli's sleeve if they went from one room to another. Nightmares plagued them, especially Tony, who woke up screaming about water. Melissa would rush in, hold him, and murmur that he was safe, she was there. Each time, she felt a pang. Did he even know what real safety was? One evening, while Melissa was helping Kaylee brush her hair, Kaylee looked up and whispered, "Is the bad man coming back?" Melissa's throat tightened. "No," she said firmly. "He won't hurt you ever again." At the station, she pored over documents linking Rowan to multiple missing child cases. Each new detail filled her with dread. She realized that for each child rescued, there were likely many more out there, trapped in the shadows. The gravity of this weighed on her. Finally, the day of the lodge operation arrived. The FBI, local cops, and state agents coordinated meticulously. Hidden cameras were placed in corners of the lodge, staff was briefed on what to do if they saw suspicious activity, and unmarked SUVs were positioned along the winding roads that led into the mountains. Melissa left the kids with the neighbor again, heartsick at her divided responsibilities. She promised to be back soon, though she had no idea how the sting would unfold. They arrived at the lodge under cover of early morning fog. The property was surrounded by dense forests, pine trees towering overhead. The main building had rustic wooden beams and large windows that overlooked a quiet lake. The place looked peaceful, but tension crackled in the air as law enforcement personnel prepared. Melissa took up position at a vantage point near the lodge entrance, dressed in casual clothes to blend in. Jenna, disguised as part of the lodge's event staff, carried a concealed firearm. Hours dragged by, the chill mountain air seeping into Melissa's bones. She kept her ear pressed to the calm earpiece, monitoring the radio chatter. Shortly after noon, a sleek black SUV rumbled up the gravel driveway. A tall, thin man stepped out, flanked by two burly individuals. The cameras discreetly zoomed in. Jenna's voice came quietly over the radio. "Confirmation, that's Rowan." Melissa's heart hammered. She recognized him from a single photograph pulled from an old archive, salt and pepper hair, a gaunt face with unsettlingly sharp features, and a posture of quiet authority. The group entered the lodge. Another occupant remained behind in the SUV, tinted windows hiding whoever might be inside. Agents watched from concealed positions, waiting for a signal that a deal or meeting was in progress. The tension was suffocating. If Rowan had children with him, they couldn't see them yet. If this was just a scouting trip, they might lose their chance. After nearly an hour, Rowan emerged from the lodge, speaking tersely into a phone. The watchers tensed. Then, as if sensing something amiss, he paused and scanned his surroundings. Melissa's pulse lurched. He suspects something, she thought. Abruptly, Rowan gestured to his bodyguards, who ushered him toward the SUV. "He's leaving," someone hissed through the radio. "We can't let him slip away." The lead agent gave the go signal. Vehicles roared to life, blocking the driveway. A helicopter that had been circling at a distance swooped lower. Rowan's men drew weapons, and chaos exploded. Shots rang out, lodge staff screamed, and law enforcement shouted for everyone to drop their guns. Melissa found herself sprinting across the lodge's lawn, adrenaline igniting every nerve. The SUV revved, trying to reverse down the drive. But an FBI van cut it off. Rowan's bodyguards opened fire, bullets smashing into the SUV and the FBI van. Agents responded, glass shattering. In the melee, Rowan ducked behind the SUV door. One of the bodyguards caught a bullet in the shoulder, collapsing with a howl. The other raised his gun at an agent, but was tackled. Rowan, seeing his men subdued, bolted into the tree line behind the lodge, ignoring the shouts to stop. Melissa cursed under her breath. She followed at a distance, weaving through towering pines. The forest floor was a tangle of fallen needles and damp undergrowth. She had no illusions about outrunning him, but she heard other agents crashing through the brush, coordinating on radio channels. A minute later, she spotted Rowan sprinting along a narrow path. An agent tackled him low, sending them both sprawling on the pine needles. Rowan lashed out with surprising strength. Melissa raced forward, gun drawn, and pinned him from the other side. The agent wrestled his arms behind his back. Rowan shouted curses, straining, but he was outnumbered. When the dust settled, Rowan was cuffed, panting, his face twisted with fury. Melissa stared at him, her breath ragged. This was the man who orchestrated the trafficking, who tore children from their families, sold them to the highest bidder. This monster, she thought, would never harm another child. The arrest was swift. Meanwhile, back at the SUV, agents found forged documents and tens of thousands of dollars in cash. No children were there at the moment, but the evidence pointed to upcoming deals. The sting was not as clean as they hoped. There had been a shootout and Rowan's men were not all accounted for. Still, the linchpin of the organization was in custody. News spread rapidly across state lines. With Rowan's arrest, a trove of information surfaced. Computers seized from his properties detailed the labyrinth of his operations: contacts, false identities, bribed officials. Over the ensuing weeks, more arrests followed in neighboring states. Children were discovered in safe houses, battered but alive, rescued before they could be sold. Melissa attended countless debriefings, gave statements to the press, and collaborated with other agencies. There was a sense of triumph, though tempered by the grim reality that some children had been lost or remained unaccounted for. The ring's infrastructure was vast, and dismantling it entirely would take time. Still, the major players were in handcuffs, facing charges that would likely keep them behind bars for life. As the dust settled, Melissa turned her focus back to the 3 kids under her roof. They had followed bits of the news, picking up on the tension in the air. One evening, after she tucked Kaylee and Tony into bed, she found Eli sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old coloring book. She joined him, and he looked up with a spark of hope. "You caught them, right?" he asked, eyes shining. "That bad man who drove us?" She nodded. "He's been caught, and so has the man behind it all. They can't hurt anyone anymore." Eli exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over his features. "So we're safe?" Melissa fought tears. "Yes, sweetheart. You're safe." In the weeks that followed, the children's progress was slow but noticeable. Kaylee began to speak more confidently, sometimes telling silly jokes. Tony warmed to Melissa, occasionally crawling into her lap for comfort. Eli still had nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, but he no longer seemed haunted every waking moment. Court cases loomed for Rowan and his associates, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, a new question arose. What would happen long-term with Eli, Kaylee, and Tony? Child Protective Services found no extended family to claim them. The risk of them being separated remained. The notion gnawed at Melissa. She wrestled with a decision that could reshape her life. Foster arrangements were meant to be temporary, but she had grown attached to these children, wanting nothing more than to give them stability. One day, she confided in Jenna, who had become a close friend during the investigation. They were both sitting outside the station, sipping coffee. "Am I crazy?" Melissa asked, voice trembling. "I'm a single officer working odd hours. Can I really adopt 3 kids?" Jenna gave her a thoughtful look. "I've seen how they look at you, how you look at them. Love counts for a lot. And you've already proven how far you'll go to protect them." That night, as she helped the children get ready for bed, she noticed Eli hugging Tony tight, whispering comforting words. Kaylee lingered by Melissa's side, fiddling with the hem of her pajamas. "Do we get to stay here forever?" Kaylee asked softly. Melissa's heart clenched. "Would you want that?" Kaylee nodded, eyes watering. Eli, overhearing, bit his lip. Tony just stared as if holding his breath. Melissa kneeled, gathering them together in a gentle embrace. "I'll do everything I can," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I want you here, all 3 of you. But we have to go through a lot of paperwork, and I can't promise it'll be quick." Eli's eyes shone with cautious hope. "But you'll try." "Absolutely," she said, hugging them. The next day, she made it official, starting the adoption process. Her supervisors at the station were supportive, offering flexible shifts when possible. Friends and neighbors donated bunk beds and children's clothing. Slowly, the 1-bedroom rental transformed into a home that might accommodate a small family. Melissa had to adapt, juggling her law enforcement duties with school enrollment forms and therapy sessions. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Rowan's trial date approached. Melissa was called to testify about her involvement in the sting, her rescue of the children, and the evidence the police had collected. The trial was high profile, with media coverage fueling public outrage at the horrors of child trafficking. Survivors testified, though many children were too traumatized or too young to appear in court. Expert witnesses read statements on their behalf. Melissa braced herself as she took the stand. She recounted finding Eli on the highway, discovering the submerged van, and the series of events that led to Rowan's arrest. Rowan sat at the defense table, cold eyes fixed on her. A shiver ran through her. His expression was devoid of remorse, a mask of reptilian detachment. The defense tried to undermine her credibility, but the evidence was irrefutable. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The verdict was unanimous. Rowan and his key associates were found guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. Sentencing would be severe. Even the defense conceded they expected decades behind bars. When news reached the station, a wave of relief and celebration rolled through the department. Jenna and the other detectives clinked coffee cups in a small toast. Melissa, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders, simply sat at her desk, tears prickling her eyes. She thought of Kaylee, Tony, and Eli, and all the other children who might finally have a chance at a safer life. A few weeks later, on a quiet weekend morning, Melissa roused her makeshift family early. They ventured out to the orchard she had once described, where the apples were in season. Kaylee and Tony scampered among the rows of trees, giggling as they tried to reach the reddest fruit. Eli walked at Melissa's side, carrying a small basket. The crisp autumn air smelled of ripe apples and damp leaves, a comforting contrast to the chaotic months they'd endured. As they picked apples, she felt a warmth in her chest. This was how life should be for these children. Simple joys, security, the chance to laugh without fear. She snapped photos on her phone, capturing Tony's wide grin, Kaylee's delighted squeal, and even Eli's cautious smile. When they returned home, arms laden with fruit, they baked an apple pie together. Flour dusted the counters, and Kaylee insisted on shaping the dough. Tony mashed pieces of apple with a fork until they were nearly applesauce. Eli carefully arranged apple slices in the pie crust, his brow furrowed in concentration. Melissa guided them through the process, occasionally glancing at the clock to make sure they wouldn't burn the crust. Later that evening, they shared slices of pie around the small kitchen table. The children laughed, this time a real, bright sound that melted Melissa's heart. She thought of how far they had come, from shivering victims of a cruel system to a budding family. Time marched on. The adoption process had its obstacles: extensive background checks, interviews, home inspections. Melissa fretted that the state might find her unfit, her house too small, her hours too irregular. But her record was spotless, and her devotion to the children shone through. With each bureaucratic step, she felt an anxious flutter, wondering if they'd come out on the other side intact. In the meantime, Kaylee and Tony started attending a local elementary school. Eli, older and more self-conscious, needed special tutoring to catch up on missed classes. Melissa arranged a part-time tutor and spent her evenings helping him read. She learned he enjoyed fantasy stories, tales of knights and dragons. She'd find him sometimes, curled up on the couch, lost in a paperback novel. There were setbacks, too. Nightmares still plagued them. Tony occasionally wet the bed, Kaylee refused to sleep without a nightlight, and Eli had bouts of depression. Therapy sessions helped, but healing was a winding road. Melissa often worried she was out of her depth. She found solace in weekly check-ins with a child psychologist who guided her, offering strategies to handle tantrums and triggers. Through it all, her promise remained, "I will not abandon you." Months later, near the end of winter, the official adoption hearing arrived. The children, now more relaxed and trusting, filed into a small courthouse with Melissa. A judge peered at the paperwork, the background checks, the character references from Jenna, from Melissa's colleagues, from neighbors. After a brief but formal proceeding, the judge smiled. "Melissa Hart, you are hereby granted permanent guardianship of these children, with full rights as their adoptive parent. Congratulations." Tears glistened in Melissa's eyes. Kaylee squealed, hugging Tony. Eli stood there, stunned, then slowly broke into a grin that lit up his face. They gathered in a group hug, and for the first time, Melissa felt the weight of official recognition for the bond she'd already embraced in her heart. In the days that followed, they settled into a routine that, while not always smooth, was undeniably a family. The station teased her about how she'd gone from single officer to mother of three. She took the jokes in stride. She was fiercely proud of her kids, and each little milestone felt like a victory. Tony making a new friend at school, Kaylee bringing home an art project, Eli writing a short story about a brave police officer who saved a dragon's eggs from poachers. When summer arrived, she managed to take a week off, and they visited the Oregon coast. She watched her kids run along the shoreline, squealing at the cold waves, building lopsided sandcastles. In quieter moments, she thought about the children who weren't so lucky, the ones who still waited for rescue or never got it at all. The memory of the warehouse cots and fake IDs haunted her. Yet that haunting pushed her to keep advocating, keep supporting the child services system from within. She volunteered for local boards, spoke at events, and used every chance to drive home the need for stronger oversight in foster care transitions. Ultimately, Rowan and his associates lost every appeal, sinking deeper into the prison system. Other traffickers were apprehended, though some remained at large. The ring had been largely dismantled, sparing countless children. Melissa still assisted in occasional queries about leftover leads, but the hectic frenzy of the case had quieted. One warm morning, after many months of living together, Melissa and the kids gathered on their porch. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, gilding the horizon with pink and orange hues. Eli sat next to Kaylee and Tony on a bench, hugging his knees. Melissa brought out a tray of orange juice. They sipped in contented silence, the early birds chirping in the old willow tree out front. Eli glanced at her, eyes thoughtful. "Do we get to stay here now? Like, forever?" Melissa's throat constricted. The love she felt for these kids was overwhelming. She set her cup down and gently ruffled his hair. "You're home," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "You never have to leave." For a moment, the significance of that promise hung in the air. The children grinned, relief and joy shining in their eyes. Melissa swallowed back tears, determined not to spoil this precious morning with crying. But inside, she felt a flood of gratitude. They had endured so much darkness, but they found the light together. In the months and years ahead, there would still be challenges. Trauma didn't vanish overnight. Yet the family they forged had resilience born of shared hardship. Melissa found herself marveling at their courage, learning as much from them as they did from her. With the biggest threats behind them, they embraced the everyday joys of a stable life: birthdays, first days of school, lazy weekends of pancakes and cartoons. And through it all, Melissa never forgot the haunting words Eli once said, "No one ever comes back for us." She was proud to be the one who proved that fear wrong, not just for him and his siblings, but for every child still waiting for a champion. Thank you so much for watching and for standing up for the belief that every child deserves protection. If you enjoyed this story and want more content like it, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep shining a light on the truth.